It's like a sound. Can you see something blue looking at me? I think Charles needs to put on it. He looks so ugly.
Stop playing with me.
And he looks like a monkey.
Look at Rika Roundtree, an 8-year-old girl full of life and creativity. She adored her dolls as if they were her own children, and her smile could lift anyone's spirits. In these photos, she seems like any other happy youngster, doesn't she? But what you can't see in these scenes is Rika's agony behind closed doors, which was so intense that it took her life. Rika was beaten, hungry, and silenced in ways that no kid should have had to go through. And it did not happen in secret. Her injuries were evident, and her calls for aid were heard, but no one responded in time. Rika's school noticed injuries and unusual conduct in the months before her death. Investigators discovered horrifying video footage of Rika being assaulted by her father's girlfriend, Cynthia Baker. Then there came the text messages, cold, harsh remarks between two people who were supposed to care for her, arranging punishments as if Rika's life didn't matter. This is a tale of unfathomable brutality, about a little girl stuck in a family where love has been replaced by violence. And it's the narrative of a system that was aware Rika was in danger but failed to take action. She was a tiny girl begging for assistance in a world that wouldn't listen. How can anything like this happen? How can an innocent youngster slide between the gaps, despite the fact that teachers, neighbors, and even child protection authorities have heard his cries? This isn't simply a narrative about abuse. It's about how a flawed system allowed it to continue. Welcome to Unseen True Crime Stories Headquarters. I want to thank you, my fantastic viewers and subscribers, for your support. Your participation in these tales, expressed via likes, shares, and comments, contributes to their significance. If you're new here, please subscribe and join our expanding community of true crime aficionados. So, let's get started. Rika Roundtree was a small girl like so many others, overflowing with joy, inventiveness, and infinite love before she made headlines. Rika was born in 2008 and grew up in a family where her mother, Antonetta Simmons, did her best to offer a feeling of stability despite the fact that the world around them was unraveling. Rika had a captivating personality, and her delight looked limitless, like a never-ending light. She had a unique ability to make everyone around her feel special, whether via amusing songs or meaningful remarks. Rika has the ability to illuminate even the darkest of rooms. Rika loved dolls, which was one of her biggest delights. But they weren't just toys for her. They were her universe. Rika adored her dolls as if they were her own children. She would clothe them lovingly, feed them, and tuck them in at night, creating a world that was both secure and enchanting. Rika saw it as more than simply play. It was an escape to a world where she could be the guardian and the harsh realities of reality could not affect her. Rika's identity was not only determined by her imagination. She was nice and considerate, which made her the apple of her mother's eye. Her mother refers to her daughter as her shadow. Wherever I went, she was right there with me, and recalls. She was not only my daughter, but also my dearest friend. We'd laugh and play together, and every day was like a new experience. However, no family is exempt from life's trials. Rika's world started to shift in 2016 in ways that no kid should ever go through. And a single mother was suffering financially. The weight of financial difficulty weighed down on her, and she was faced with a choice that no parent wants to make. Desperate to maintain a roof over their heads and food on the table, and made a decision that permanently changed Rika's life. In order to survive, and began selling drugs. It was not motivated by avarice, but by the crushing burden of existence. N's actions were desperate, but not malicious. But in September 2016, her action resulted in her arrest. For Rika and her elder brother, this was the point at which their lives became unclear. Rika was removed from her mother and put in the care of her biological father, Richard Roundtree, whom and had never entirely trusted. N's heart crushed that day. She asked the authorities not to send Rika to live with her dad. She sensed something was wrong, but her warnings went unheard. I begged them not to send her there, and subsequently recounted. I knew she would not be safe. I informed them something was wrong, but no one listened. She also said they didn't listen and didn't care. They simply saw my arrest, not the attachment I had with my kid. They didn't mind that I knew her better than anyone. They didn't listen when I warned them she wasn't safe there, and was unaware, and the authorities decided to disregard that Rika was not just going to live with her father. She was entering a household with a history of abuse and neglect. Cynthia Baker, Richard's girlfriend, would also be there. Cynthia had a documented history of abuse, including a previous accusation of trying to drown a stepchild. It was a history that should have triggered red lights right away, but DCFS chose to overlook the warning indicators. DCFS made a crucial judgment. They put Rika in a household where her safety was far from assured. They saw Richard as a safer alternative, dismissing Ann's warnings and the danger lurking in the shadows of her new house. What they couldn't see, or decided not to see, was the trauma that Rika would face. Rika's life had changed from the beginning. She was no longer a treasured kid, nor was she regarded as a daughter at all. She was seen as a burden, a nuisance to be torn down. Cynthia made sure of it. At barely 8 years old, Rika was exposed to cruel and demeaning punishments. She was compelled to handle big cans of food, her little arms quivering beneath their weight. These torturous sessions lasted hours, not minutes or seconds. Cynthia would strike out whenever her arms drooped from tiredness. The beatings became commonplace, a daily occurrence. Rika's isolation was total. She was not permitted to have meals with the family. While the other youngsters ate, Rika sat alone, hungry and humiliated. Her clothes were ragged, hand-me-down garments that showed signs of neglect. She didn't have a bed, only a chilly, bare mattress on the floor where she could rest after a long day. Her favorite dolls? They were completely demolished. The world she had constructed, the pleasure she once discovered, was gradually taken away from her. But physical violence was just the beginning. The emotional torture was even greater. Cynthia intended to shatter not only her body, but also her soul. She cut Rika off from her family and from the spirit of what it meant to be a kid. A small girl whose childhood was supposed to be full of joy and love, but was instead consumed with terror. The Department of Children and Family Services had several opportunities to act, yet they consistently failed. Multiple allegations from teachers, neighbors, and even concerned school personnel voiced concerns about the abuse occurring in the Roundtree residence. However, the system failed to safeguard her. Let's rewind. In early 2016, a local elementary school teacher spotted bruising on Rika's arms. She reported it to DCFS, who launched an inquiry. Caseworkers went to the Roundtree residence, but nothing came of it. Weeks passed, yet the bruises persisted. In September 2016, another instructor observed marks on Rika's face. This time, the complaint went directly to DCFS, but the caseworker merely tagged it as investigated and closed it with no further action. No one checked on Rika to see whether she was okay. Rika began third grade at Fox Creek Elementary in Bloomington in the autumn of 2018, when she was just 8 years old. Cynthia's 6-year-old daughter's kindergarten classroom would see yet another weird and scary episode, prompting another DCFS inquiry. It all began one day when Fox Creek staff observed something strange. Rika was going to school without a winter coat, despite the frigid Illinois conditions. The school staff, out of pure goodwill, took it upon themselves to present Rika with a warm coat, which every kid deserves. Cynthia, however, responded angrily rather than gratefully. She came into school, enraged, accusing the staff of partiality. She was enraged that they were choosing Rika above her own kid, who, by the way, already had her own winter suit. The weird and upsetting event did not stop there. Only days later, on December 10th, 2018, DCFS received another complaint of abuse involving Rika. Rika had missed 2 days of school, only to return with 2 black eyes, each at varying stages of healing. This was the turning moment. Once again, the system had the opportunity to interfere. DCFS sent Patricia Shannon, a child safety expert, to conduct an investigation. This wasn't the first time Rika had suffered such damage, but despite its recurrent failures, the system was still functioning. Shannon came at school, prepared to ask Rika about the wounds on her face. Holly Bellotto, the school nurse, raised worry about Rika's apparent injuries, saying they did not seem to be from an accidental fall. Despite the nurse's evidence, Rika was once again too terrified to speak up. She told Miss Shannon that she had been out ill one day and then fell on her toys while storing them in her closet, a credible explanation if the truth were that easy. Rika's mother, Anne, had a terrible sensation that Rika was reluctant to tell the truth. She was terrified Rika would continue to lie to protect the people who had mistreated her, and that admitting the truth would result in much greater punishment. A youngster should not have to live with the fear of being punished for revealing the truth. Even after receiving this complaint, DCFS continued to try to interfere. They requested Richard and Cynthia to take Rika to the doctor. In a worrying turn, Richard informed DCFS that Rika's doctor was on vacation and that, despite his daughter's evident injuries, they couldn't afford the emergency hospital visit. It would cost $200, he explained. But it wasn't just about the money. The true problem arose when Cynthia declined to transport Rika for additional medical care. She informed DCFS that Rika's medical card had expired and that she just did not have enough time with the other children to care for the one who needed it the most. The unwillingness to seek medical treatment did not stop there. Cynthia was ordered by the doctor in Pontiac to take Rika for an X-ray to determine the severity of her injuries. But, once again, she disobeyed the directions. Instead, she disregarded the X-ray as unnecessary, citing her busy schedule. Cynthia had shrugged off the need for good medical treatment before, and it would not be the last. On December 11th, 2018, Cynthia's adolescent daughter was interviewed mere hours after receiving a call from DCFS. The daughter, who was not home when Rika allegedly fell on her toys, seemed to know more than she had said. She acknowledged that Rika had described the event, albeit the specifics were hazy. The same day, DCFS tried to talk with Cynthia's 6-year-old daughter, but Cynthia refused. She obstructed their efforts, blocking a thorough probe into the household's maltreatment. It was becoming evident that, despite accumulating evidence, the system was failing to safeguard Rika. Rika's school counselor phoned DCFS again, this time to report that Rika was withdrawing. Her grades dropped, and she was exhibiting indications of serious mental turmoil. Despite the continuous complaints, caseworkers only came to the house a couple more times. They saw the injuries and heard the tales, yet they all went without giving any meaningful help. Despite accumulating evidence that something went dreadfully wrong, the case was always described as resolved. Rika's health deteriorated throughout the course of months. By April 2019, she had become noticeably weaker. Her formerly brilliant eyes have become dull and distant. Her instructors, who had known her since kindergarten, noticed a significant difference. The girl who used to laugh and engage enthusiastically in class had retreated. She no longer lifted her hand or smiled. She stopped speaking. Mrs. Harris, one of Rika's instructors, described how Rika seemed to shrink in front of her. She used to arrive to school full of energy, but by spring, she was scarcely there. She sat at her desk, scarcely able to look at anybody. It was as if she was afraid to even laugh, the instructor said. She was quite quiet. She was usually the first to volunteer, but now she refuses to speak up in class. And every time I inquired whether she was all right, she would just answer, "I'm okay." If I could see injuries on her arms, neck, and legs. I had previously reported it and continued to do so, but nothing changed. However, on the night of January 6, 2018, Cynthia Baker pushed her too far. The penalties had grown more regular and harsh. What occurred that night remains a mystery, but one thing is certain. Rika's body, already damaged and shattered by months of abuse, could no longer resist the torture. On that fateful night, Rika's little body succumbed to the assault. She was gone. As the medical personnel tried tirelessly to rescue her, the truth dawned. Rika had endured far too much. The life draining from her little body was not a random act of destiny. It was the outcome of an unthinkable, long-term pattern of abuse. So, with no more fight in her, Rika Roundtree was proclaimed dead at the age of 8. She was gone. Rika's physique, spoken narrative or words, could no longer convey. The nurses and physicians saw it. Bruises of all sizes, some new, some old, covering her petite body. Her back, arms, and even her face displayed the scars of months of torture. Her flesh showed signs of being assaulted with fists, weapons, and even shoes. It was evident that this was not an accident. Rika had undergone relentless torture. Dr. Matthew Fox conducted an autopsy on Rika Roundtree, age 8, on January 26, 2019, at the Peoria County Coroner's Office. What he discovered was nothing short of sad, a terrible testimonial to the torture this little child had suffered. Dr. Fox's report described an unfathomable number of injuries. More than 60 scars covered Rika's little body. Her face, chin, mouth, chest, back, forearms, hands, buttocks, thighs, and legs all exhibited the brutal scars of her misery. Those scars, however, were just on the surface. Inside, the destruction was devastating. Dr. Fox discovered an ileal perforation, a tear in the last part of the small intestine, adhesions in the abdominal cavity where scar tissue had formed inside her abdomen, bruises on her face and upper arm, bleeding around the pancreas, pulmonary edema, or fluid in her lungs, cerebral edema, fluid buildup around her brain, and an abdomen filled with blood, indicating massive internal trauma. Dr. Fox determined that Rika's death was caused by peritonitis, a serious infection of the abdominal lining. This illness, induced by a blunt force injury, resulted in severe inflammation and infection. Her little body was just unable to fight longer. Peritonitis does not need to be lethal. It may be treated if detected early. It is diagnosed via X-rays, blood tests, scans, and, in certain cases, exploratory surgery. Rika had been vomiting for at least 2 days before her death. She complained of stomachache. Cynthia Baker herself stated Rika had impaired vision and difficulty maintaining her balance. Those were obvious, urgent indicators that something was very wrong. Rika's life may have been saved if she had sought medical attention, but she wasn't. Rika's calls for aid were disregarded, and her misery rejected. She was left for dead. Exactly 5 days after Rika's death, on January 31st, 2019, the Department of Children and Family Services received a new report. This time, it claimed that Richard Roundtree and Cynthia Baker had breached the safety plan by maintaining contact with their surviving children. It begs a scary question. Were they attempting to trick the youngsters into maintaining their secret? Were they attempting to dominate the narrative before the truth could be revealed? Even though no criminal charges have been filed, Richard and Cynthia retained an attorney right away. They didn't have a funeral or a monument. Instead, they transported Rika's remains to a funeral parlor in Gilbert for cremation. There is no ceremony or final farewell. But Rika would not be forgotten that quickly. On February 2nd, 2019, right before her cremation, McLean County officials intervened. They took Rika's corpse to do a second, more thorough autopsy. This time, Dr. Scott Denon, chief forensic pathologist, conducted the examination. Rika's corpse was burned on February 11th, after the second autopsy was finished. On February 11th, 2019, Richard and Cynthia's other children were removed into protective care. For those youngsters, the horror may have finally ended. However, for Rika, it was much too late. What remains of the wounds she left not just on her little, bruised body, but also on the hearts of all who have heard her tale. Nonetheless, Cynthia Baker, the lady guilty for this savagery, showed no regret, anguish, or grief. Instead, she was fixated on something genuinely shocking: the devastation Rika had left behind. Witnesses said that Cynthia's initial remarks after learning that Rika had died were not about her child's life being taken. No, it was about the puke on the ground. "You better clean that up. It's disgusting," she added, unconcerned about the fact that her actions had just resulted in a child's death. That instant revealed all you needed to know. Cynthia did not care about Rika's life or her pain. Only the hassle of cleaning up after a deceased kid seems to bother her. However, the entire extent of what had occurred in that home remained unknown until detectives discovered something that changed everything. When they looked through Cynthia's phone, they discovered videos that would torment the country. There were videos that exposed everything. Cynthia's iCloud account has unsettling video that depicts the hidden reality. These weren't simply benign recordings. They were proof of an abusive existence, one in which Rika was nothing more than a punching bag for Cynthia's brutality. The footage was terrible. In one video, Cynthia can be seen shouting at Rika and pushing her to do mundane activities under fear of punishment. In another, she violently abuses the youngster. Rika's petite body trembles in dread as she tries in vain to defend herself. It was cruelty documented on video, providing conclusive evidence of the abuse she underwent. These films, which were previously concealed from the public, now served as indisputable proof that screamed louder than words. What had previously been a silent, unseen horror for Rika was suddenly evident to everyone. As detectives and prosecutors saw the video, their astonishment and bewilderment were obvious. How has this gone overlooked for so long? How could a small girl suffer such agony for months, if not years, without someone intervening to stop it? When the videos were disclosed to the press, the people responded quickly. Outrage erupted on the streets, and newsrooms were inundated with calls. The community, previously oblivious, wanted answers. How had this continued for so long? Why hadn't someone stepped in to rescue Rika? This was no longer about a single broken household. It was a wake-up call to the whole nation. How could the system have failed so completely? How could those who were meant to be protecting youngsters like Rika turn a blind eye? Cynthia Baker was arrested on April 24, 2019. She faced a litany of accusations, including first-degree murder, severe violence, and many counts of child abuse. The wheels of justice were finally turning. For once, it seemed like the judicial system was reacting to the urgency of the situation. However, the war was not over. Cynthia's arrest was simply the beginning of a protracted court battle. The people paid great attention, and the media covered every detail. Every twist in the case was analyzed by a country still reeling from what had transpired. Rika's family experienced unimaginable emotional agony. Rika's mother, Anne, was forced to cope with the heartbreaking repercussions of losing her child. Every day, she had to confront the heartbreaking realization that she could not protect Rika. She once said, "Every day without her feels like a lifetime. I wish I could have protected her. I failed her. I'll always fail her." Rika's immediate relatives were not the only ones who suffered. This tragedy ripped through the whole community. Friends, neighbors, and instructors all looked back with deep sorrow. Cynthia Baker, accused of the horrible murder of Rika Roundtree at the age of 8, was on one side of the courtroom as the proceedings began. On the other side, the prosecution is committed to deliver justice to the young child who was never given a chance. The prosecution's case was both straightforward and unsettling. They started with forensic proof, the kind that never lies. Rika's physique, once vibrant, was now a somber reminder of the suffering she'd endured. Her little physique was covered in bruises, each of which told a narrative of brutality and anguish. Burns disfigured her flesh, the result of severe punishments imposed on her for far too long. However, internal injuries sealed the deal. An autopsy showed the truth. Rika's abdomen had been severely wounded, resulting in burst organs and a large rip that caused peritonitis, poisoning her insides. That injury was the fatal strike that ended her life. And the study made it obvious that these were not the results of a single occurrence, but rather a pattern of systemic abuse. Then came the videos, which were concealed in Cynthia Baker's iCloud account. They were awful evidence of Rika's mistreatment. No youngster should ever be subjected to such grainy material. But there they were, Rika, trembling, tormented by the woman who should have loved and protected her. Cynthia screamed at Rika in one video, forcing her to scrub floors for hours on end as her little arms trembled with tiredness. Another spotted Cynthia hitting Rika across the face, and the child's look was one of horror as she struggled to hide herself from additional hits. It was horrible, and the jurors understood. There was no denying what they were seeing. The video was a game changer. Cynthia's doom was sealed not only with evidence, but with proof. The jurors were startled and could not turn away from the reality. But the trauma did not stop with the videos. Cynthia's own children, flesh and blood, were summoned to the stand. They had to tell the misery they had endured in secret for so long. Their voices quivered, and the recollections were too terrible to endure. They'd seen it all: beatings, seclusion, and brutality that transformed a home into a jail. One of her daughters described how they would find Rika sobbing in hidden places, too scared to approach their mother. They saw Cynthia's rage flare up at the slightest error, and Rika's innocent face was bathed in tears, pleading for forgiveness that never came. By the time Rika's relatives entered the stand, the courtroom was filled with raw emotion. Rika's mother, and stood there with red eyes and a shaky voice. She told about a tiny child who liked to play and would rush to her with delight and excitement. But suddenly that kid was gone, her brilliant soul extinguished in the most horrible manner possible. Ann's comments were filled with grief as she reflected on her daughter's life. It was the sound of a mother, broken yet determined to be heard. And through her tears, she made it clear, "I do not want my daughter's death to be forgotten. I want everyone to know what happened to her." The trial lasted many weeks, but the ultimate conclusion was unambiguous. Cynthia Baker was convicted of first-degree murder. The truth had been revealed, and the jury was convinced. This lady was guilty for the murder of an innocent kid. However, on July 14th, 2019, Cynthia Baker's destiny was sealed. Life in jail with no prospect of release. The judge's remarks were definitive. There would be no second chances for the mother who had taken the life of an innocent child. Yes, it was a modest win for justice, but it could not bring Rika back. It could never heal the wounds or years of misery. All that left was the brutal reality. One life had been stolen, and it was lost forever. While Cynthia faced her day of reckoning, Rika's father, Richard Roundtree, was also dealing with the repercussions of his own failure. For years, Richard had seen his daughter struggle under the house of his companion, Cynthia. He saw the bruises and heard the screaming, yet he decided to do nothing. He failed her. Richard was aware of the abuse and what was going on, but he chose to remain silent. He let it happen, and for that, he would also be held responsible. A series of text conversations exchanged between Richard and Cynthia corroborated this. The disturbing text exchanges between Richard Roundtree and Cynthia Baker revealed a much worse scenario than anybody could have guessed. These communications, received between July and September 2018, indicated not just their strong hatred for tiny Rika, but also their direct involvement in the cruelty she suffered. They wanted her gone. They talked about her in ways that no kid should ever be spoken of. On July 16, 2018, Cynthia described Rika as a little hard-headed. Just a few days later, on July 19th, Cynthia told Richard that she thought Rika should leave. Richard said, "It is, babe." This wasn't simply a statement of exasperation. It was an agreement to get rid of a little child in need of love and care. In another message, Cindy said, "I'm not talking to that little girl. She never tells the truth until you have a belt around her." As if slapping a youngster into submission was an appropriate method of obtaining the facts. Later, she texted Richard, "I love you too, but damn, I really hate your daughter." The remarks were frigid, but the hate was sincere. And it was scary. The messages did not end there. Cynthia contacted Richard on September 5th, 2018, saying, "I told Rika she was playing in the dark and hit her eye." Richard said, "Sounds good to me." A planned falsehood about the harm they were causing to a vulnerable infant. And how did they come to feel this approach was acceptable? Nothing more than a warped collaboration. As horrifying as these messages were, as insights into Rika's suffering, Nothing could have prepared those in the courtroom for what they were about to see. Videos that would reveal the full degree of Rika's fear at the hands of individuals who should have loved and protected her. So on August 12, 2019, Richard Roundtree entered a plea agreement. He received an 8-year jail term in return for pleading guilty to charges of endangering the life of a child. 8 years is a little price to pay for a dad who permitted his daughter to be tortured and murdered. It wasn't quite enough. However, it served as a reminder that Richard's inactivity had contributed to the disaster. And, although his punishment was much less harsh than Cynthia's, it was still a price to pay for a father's failure to safeguard his kid. Rika's death showed major deficiencies in the Department of Children and Family Services. Multiple allegations of abuse were submitted by teachers and others, but no significant action was taken. These mistakes were not unique. They exposed a flawed system riddled with understaffing, inadequate training, and bureaucratic red tape. Ann's effort has resulted in significant improvement. In 2020, Ann collaborated with politicians to design a measure intended at increasing accountability within DCFS. Known colloquially as Rika's Law, the proposal asks for tougher regulation of child welfare situations, obligatory background checks for all caregivers, and frequent follow-ups on alleged abuse. While Rika's Law is still in development, it is an important step in ensuring that no other kid slips through the gaps of a broken system. Ann's drive is encouraging change, one policy at a time. Rika's tale is more than simply a tragedy. It is about the lessons we must learn as a community. It is about the collective obligation we all have to safeguard the most vulnerable among us. It's about the warning signals that were overlooked, the screams for assistance that went unanswered, and the systems that failed to act when it counted the most. It serves as a reminder that safeguarding children is our collective obligation, not simply that of parents and teachers. Rika's tale prompts us to raise difficult questions. How can we guarantee that no kid suffers in silence? How can we hold systems responsible for failing to safeguard people they are supposed to serve? Rika's light was doused much too soon, but her tale will live on as a beacon of change. Justice for Rika is justice for all children. Let her tale serve as a reminder to never look away, to never remain quiet, and to always protect those who cannot defend themselves. Which part of the story moved you the most? Please share your ideas in the comments below. And while you're here, make sure to check out our other videos, like them, and subscribe to help support our channel. The 911 dispatcher's voice cracked through the phone line, calm yet urgent. "What's your emergency?" A terrified mother muttered, "There's a child not breathing," as her response. Responders raced to an apartment in Seaside, Oregon. Inside, they were welcomed with stillness, broken only by stifled tears. Evangelina Wing, 2 years old, was discovered unresponsive on her side in a poorly lighted bedroom. Her petite frame was covered with bruises, discoloration around her neck, and dried blood around her ears. She was already in complete rigor mortis. The physicians were troubled not just by her dead body, but also by the narrative her injuries revealed. Bite wounds, burns, and shattered bones formed a bleak picture of agony and anguish. How could anybody allow this happen to a child? Seaside, Oregon, a tranquil coastal town famed for its serene beaches, was suddenly the site of a terrible tragedy. Evangelina had lived here with her mother, Dorothy Wing, and her 2 younger brothers. Dorothy, a single mother striving to care for her family, seemed to be no different from any other parent fighting to get by. But only weeks before Evangelina died, a new person entered their lives. Dorothy met Randy Roden, a guy with a troubled background, and encouraged him to move in after just a week of meeting him. Randy rapidly assumed the job of caretaker while Dorothy worked long hours. To the outside world, this seemed to be a necessity-driven collaboration, but within the apartment, an unsettling reality was taking form. At first look, Evangelina's death seemed to be an unfortunate accident. Dorothy said that her daughter had fallen over the toilet a few days ago. However, when detectives looked further, they discovered a horrific pattern of abuse that lasted months. Evangelina's murder was not an isolated occurrence. It was the result of ongoing abuse against not just her, but also her two brothers. This was more than just one act of violence. It was the narrative of systematic failure, deception, and terrible brutality that transformed a once-loving household into a house of horrors. What happened would be remembered as one of the most disturbing child abuse instances in Clatsop County history, leaving a community broken and seeking for answers. Hello and welcome to Unseen True Crime Stories HQ. I appreciate you, my viewers, and particularly my subscribers, for your continued support as we strive to improve and offer you new and untold real crime tales every day. Please do not forget to subscribe to this channel. So let's get started. Evangelina Wing, born on January 22, 2011, was the kind of youngster who could light up a room with her grin. She had huge, inquiring eyes and a giggle that made everyone like her. Evangelina's universe was tiny but full of affection, focused on her siblings. A 5-year-old brother who loved her and a younger brother who matched her insatiable enthusiasm. The three youngsters were a close-knit trio, and their laughing could frequently be heard throughout the tiny apartment they shared in Seaside, Oregon. Their mother, Dorothy Wing, worked valiantly to provide for children. As a single mom, she juggled grueling hours and minimal finances, yet she never let her children feel unwanted. But behind the surface, fissures in the family's delicate equilibrium began to appear. Dorothy was fatigued. Juggling work and parenting on her own had taken its toll, and although she masked it well, those closest to her knew she craved company, someone to share the load of raising her children. In the autumn of 2014, Dorothy met Randy Roden. Their paths intersected unexpectedly, and Dorothy regarded Randy as a beacon of hope. He was attractive, attentive, and seemed willing to take on the role of a father figure for her children. Randy's attention seemed like a lifeline to a lady who had been navigating the murky seas of single parenthood on her own. But Dorothy was unaware of, or maybe chose not to perceive, the darkness behind Randy's surface. Randy Roden's background was filled with violence and domination. His criminal record includes charges for domestic violence, sexual assault, and abduction. He had a history of deceiving and assaulting women, resulting in a path of destroyed lives. However, he had a knack of concealing his real character by portraying himself as the answer to his suffering single mother's prayers. Randy moved into Dorothy's little flat less than a week after they met. It was a rash choice that sparked suspicion among neighbors, but Dorothy seemed determined to make it work. She told friends that Randy made her feel protected, that he was terrific with the kids, and that maybe, just maybe, things were finally looking up for her family. Randy wasted little time integrating into the family's everyday routine. Dorothy worked hard hours to make ends meet, so he rapidly became the main caretaker. At first, it seemed like a godsend, so Dorothy started to depend on him, taking solace in the fact that she wasn't alone anymore. But Randy's assistance came with strings attached. He began making choices without consulting Dorothy, therefore establishing authority over the home. His passion erupted at the slightest inconvenience, but he was careful to channel his rage when Dorothy was not there. The youngsters, who were before carefree and full of life, started to retreat. Initially, the alterations were modest. Neighbors remarked that the youngsters, who were formerly so active, were now seldom seen playing outdoors. When they did step outside, there were signs of trouble, a bruise on Evangelina's arm, and the 5-year-old walked with a limp. When questioned, Dorothy dismissed concerns, claiming that the children were just clumsy. Inside the flat, the evidence of neglect and abuse were becoming more obvious. Dorothy and Randy's arguments got louder, pouring through the building's thin walls. The once warm and inviting environment was transformed into one of dread and control. Evangelina, the energetic young girl who used to dance to music in the living room, became silent. She clutched to her siblings, her joy giving way to a terrified quiet. Her brothers, who were too little to properly comprehend what was going on, started to endure the bodily consequences of Randy's presence. By December 2014, The tragedy that had been building inside the Wing family had reached a breaking point. Evangelina's brightness was waning, and the bruises could no longer be explained away. The events that followed would reveal the awful truth of life within that flat, leaving a community wondering how it had gotten to this point. The facts of the abuse are truly astounding and horrible. Evangelina's once smooth, silky skin has become a patchwork of bruises, cuts, and discoloration. The medical examiner subsequently described the injuries as darkening around her neck, which indicated strangling, blood collecting in her earlobes, and bite marks on all of her small fingers. She was missing a fingernail on each hand, which might have been caused by acute trauma or long-term maltreatment. Her left arm, shattered from shoulder to wrist, was carelessly wrapped in an ace bandage. Under the bandage, the humerus bone had twisted into a spiral fracture, which specialists ascribed to someone forcibly tugging and twisting her arm. Seriously, who would do this to a child? But the nightmare did not end there. Randy's fury also fell on Evangelina's brothers. Her 5-year-old brother was discovered with severe bruises all over his body, healing burns on his ears and nose, and a shattered pelvis, an injury uncommon even in high-impact trauma cases. His head was covered with sores, and both of his eyes were swelled shut from internal bleeding, which medical specialists said was consistent with direct strikes to the face. The 2-year-old brother also had serious injuries, including many bruises, swelling on his face, and a puncture hole inside his mouth that allowed air to enter the tissue of his jaw. His injuries revealed a frightening picture of planned, continuous brutality. The children's stories provide further light on the terror they experienced. When questioned by authorities, the 5-year-old reported being tied like a dog inside the residence. The shackles left raw bruises on his wrists and ankles, and the boys described being trapped in their chamber for hours, sometimes days, with no food or drink. Randy's tactics were not only harsh, but also premeditated, with the goal of physically and emotionally breaking the children. Honestly, no kid should ever have to go through this. It's cruel and one of the worst examples possible. The apartment itself mirrored the terror within. Toys were abandoned in corners, neglected and forgotten. The air had a foul stink of neglect, unclean clothing, rotten food, and a lingering scent of terror. The walls seemed to absorb the children's screams, obscuring Randy's authority. Evangelina, formerly a happy and energetic child, started to dwindle. She stopped dancing and laughing. Her sparkling eyes, once filled with inquiry, now seemed hollow, reflecting the weight of her pain. She clung to her siblings, taking consolation in their shared misery. But even their link couldn't keep her safe from the growing torture. While Randy's harshness caused bodily harm, Dorothy's inactivity solidified her involvement in the disaster. Dorothy may have first trusted Randy's explanations. The bruising were accidental, and the burns were the result of careless play. But when the damage got too severe to overlook, her quiet became deafening. Dorothy's history showed a lady battling her own issues. As a single mother, she was overwhelmed by the duties of parenting 3 children alone. Randy entered her life like a lifeline, providing the assistance she so sorely needed. But his assistance came at a cost. He immediately took control, manipulating Dorothy with a mix of charm and intimidation. In imagined inner monologues, Dorothy may have struggled with her shame and fear. This isn't right, but what can I do? I can't do this alone. Do the kids need a father figure? Randy's influence drained her confidence, leaving her immobilized and unable to act. Neighbors sometimes overheard conflicts via the thin apartment walls. Randy's voice would erupt, followed by Dorothy's quiet objections. But these moments of resistance were fleeting. Dorothy's fear of Randy, or maybe her own denial, kept her involved. She let Randy chastise the kids, disregarded their pleas, and turned a blind eye to their injuries. Dorothy failed to protect her children when they most needed her, whether due to fear, dependence, or apathy. By December 2014, Evangelina's little body had given up. She had grown more sluggish, her energies depleted by the constant abuse. Her injuries made it difficult for her to move and play with her siblings. Her hunger had dwindled, and she spent the most of her time laying down, unable to gather the strength to interact with the world around her. On December 19th, 2014, Evangelina was clearly sick. She didn't have the energy to eat or play. Dorothy observed, but did nothing, perhaps dismissing her symptoms as fatigue or a little sickness. Randy, as usual, was disdainful. He dismissed Dorothy's fears and told her to let Evangelina rest. That night, Dorothy put Evangelina to bed in her room. Dorothy discovered her daughter unconscious in the early morning hours of December 20th, 2014. Evangelina's little body was chilly and rigid, her face bruised and discolored. Dorothy dialed 911, her voice shaking with panic. "My daughter isn't breathing." When emergency personnel arrived, they were confronted with a spectacle that would haunt them forever. Evangelina's dead corpse lying on her side, wounded and battered, in complete rigor mortis. The outward evidence of abuse revealed a history of ongoing assault, neglect, and misery. As detectives started to put together the facts, it became evident that Evangelina's death was not a terrible accident, but rather the consequence of months of unspeakable brutality. This amount of suffering and brutality may bring anybody to tears, eliciting both profound empathy and fervent rage against all forms of child abuse. But the horror did not stop there. In another room, two little boys sat quietly on a shabby mattress. Their eyes, once brilliant with the innocence of infancy, now looked blankly into space. The 5-year-old's face was severely swelled, and his eyes were almost closed due to internal hemorrhaging. His ears and nose were burnt, and his pelvis had been broken, which physicians subsequently described as a horrifyingly unusual injury in youngsters. The 2-year-old, little more than a newborn, had bruises all over his body and a puncture wound in his mouth, proof of horrible violence. Responders swiftly recognized the risk these youngsters were still in. The youngsters were promptly evacuated from their residence and sent to Randall Children's Hospital for medical assessments. Meanwhile, Dorothy and Randy were arrested. Dorothy seemed dazed, with a combination of terror and remorse flashing over her face. Randy, on the other hand, showed no remorse, his demeanor chilly and unconcerned, as if it were just another day. The authorities realized they were dealing with more than just a horrible accident. Here was the face of intentional, meticulous abuse, a reality much worse than they had anticipated. The inquiry started in earnest, with Evangelina's autopsy providing light on the atrocities she had experienced. The medical examiner methodically documented her injuries, each one a stunning indication of months of mistreatment. The fatality resulted from blunt force injuries to the head. Her little skull exhibited symptoms of hemorrhage, and her brain swelled, indicating a severe concussion. These injuries were not just recent. They were committed with terrible, purposeful force. What had she done to deserve this? Even adults cannot withstand this kind of suffering, and the worst examples of torture in jail pale in comparison. Evangelina's left arm had been twisted into a spiral fracture, which experts said could only happen if someone forcibly wrenched and twisted her arm. The adult-sized bite scars on her fingers were horrible proof of the merciless anguish she had endured. Her fingernails were pulled off her hands, revealing raw, delicate skin underneath. The examination also found discoloration around her neck and damaged capillaries in her eyes, indicating that she had been strangled at some time. Her body was a map of pain, with bruises, lacerations, and scars in different states of healing. This was not a one-time act of violence. It was persistent torture. Her siblings' assessments were similarly awful. The 5-year-old had a shattered pelvis, burns to his nose and ears, and scalp lesions. His face was swollen and bruised, and his eyes had been injured by repeated strikes. The 2-year-old had a puncture hole in his mouth, bruises on his face and chest, and previous injuries that had not been addressed. The medical experts at Randall Youngsters' Hospital agreed that these youngsters had been living in misery. With the evidence increasing, the police shifted their attention to Dorothy and Randy. Dorothy was charged with homicide and criminal mistreatment, with her inactivity seen as cooperation in the abuse. Randy faced allegations of murder, manslaughter, assault, and criminal abuse. Search warrants discovered further proof of the abuse. Blood stains were discovered on clothes, and neighbors reported hearing cries and screaming from the flat. Investigators also discovered shackles used by Randy to confine the youngsters, which confirmed the boys' claims of being chained like dogs. Dorothy's interviews depicted a woman damaged by manipulation and terror. She acknowledged to observing the injuries, but said she felt helpless to intervene. "I didn't know what to do," she informed officers. However, when confronted with irrefutable proof of her inability to safeguard her children, the justifications fell flat. The discovery of Evangelina's corpse and forensic evidence signaled the start of a case that would stun the country. The line catches powerful emotion, but may be adjusted for clarity and effect. But as the court struggle approached, one concern stayed in everyone's minds. What punishment could these monsters masquerading as people really deserve? In court, the prosecution presented a terrible scenario. Randy Roden, they contended, was more than just a substandard caretaker. He was the mastermind behind unspeakable brutality. They portrayed him as a cunning, vicious monster who preyed on a defenseless family, leaving a path of physical and emotional destruction in his wake. The chronology of events was clear and irrefutable. The prosecution made a clear distinction between the children's life before and after Randy came in. Photos of Evangelina and her siblings taken in the summer of 2014 revealed healthy, happy children. Evangelina with her broad grin and brilliant eyes, and her brothers laughing and carefree. The photographs, however, altered once Randy joined their life in October. The bruises began little and gradually grew. Evangelina's radiance faded as her ailments worsened, ending in her untimely death in December. Evangelina didn't just fall off a toilet, the prosecutor said, their voice quivering with restraint. She was tortured. Photographs of Evangelina's bruises, bite scars, and missing fingernails were shown to the jury as proof that she had been subjected to deliberate assault rather than neglect. Witness after witness took the stand to support the evidence. Neighbors said that they heard yelling and weeping coming from the wing apartment. The prosecution did not stop with the children's injuries. They also investigated Randy's background, revealing a pattern of domestic abuse, manipulation, and control. Court documents showed a guy who had frequently hurt women and children, a predator who hid behind charm and seemed to care. The evidence was undeniable. However, Randy's defense team chose a different tactic that seemed almost desperate in the face of such overwhelming evidence. They claimed that Evangelina died as a result of an undiscovered staph infection that led to sepsis rather than mistreatment. A pediatric forensic pathologist testified for the defense, alleging that the bacterial infection had moved into Evangelina's circulation, causing organ failure. They proposed that the obvious lesions on her body, such as bite marks and bruises, may have been indicators of an illness rather than evidence of maltreatment. However, the defense's approach went farther. They intended to completely put the responsibility upon Dorothy. Randy's counsel painted her as a manipulative, irresponsible mother who had a history of abusing her children even before Randy came. These showed photos of the children with minor injuries, saying these were proof of Dorothy's maltreatment. Randy, they maintained, was only attempting to assist a struggling mother in keeping her family together. The defense also questioned the prosecution's use of forensic odontology. They stated that the bite mark evidence pointing to Randy was untrustworthy and had not been properly confirmed. They probed the prosecution's expert on why certain tests had not been conducted, hoping to raise doubts in the jury's minds. However, as strong as their arguments were on paper, they collapsed in the face of the prosecution's crushing evidence. The injuries were too serious and particular to be explained away by infection or chance. The trial was a whirlwind of emotions. Medical specialists and detectives talked in measured tones, their professionalism hardly hiding their pain. One physician stopped to compose herself while explaining the degree of the children's injuries, her voice cracking as she recounted the spiral fracture in Evangelina's arm. The jury was noticeably shocked. Several members looked away when grisly images of Evangelina's corpse were shown on screens in the courtroom. Others wiped away tears as they listened to recordings of the 5-year-old kid explaining how he and his siblings were tied like dogs in their house. However, after weeks of testimony, the jury made their conclusion. Randy Roden was convicted of murder, manslaughter, assault, and criminal mistreatment. The penalty was severe, 40 years in jail. But the narrative did not stop there. Randy's defense team challenged his conviction years later, claiming that the prosecution's bite mark evidence was scientifically invalid. To the community's indignation, the Oregon Court of Appeals lowered Randy's sentence to just 20 years, leaving many feeling that justice had been denied. Dorothy, who had reached a plea agreement with prosecutors, pled guilty to homicide and criminal abuse. She obtained a 15-year term in return for her testimony against Randy. While some considered her punishment mild, considering her part in the children's misery, others regarded it as a necessary compromise to achieve Randy's conviction. When the specifics of Evangelina Wing's case became public, the town of Seaside, Oregon, was shocked and enraged. Neighbors who had observed the youngsters playing outdoors felt guilty, as if they had overlooked the warning signals. Randy Roden's first sentence of 40 years offered some relief, but when it was lowered to 20 years after an appeal, the indignation resurfaced. How could the court allow this to happen? One neighbor mourned. He tormented those children, and now he may walk out of jail in only 2 decades. Legal experts challenged the reliance on bite mark evidence, which was a key element of the appeal. According to one expert, this instance demonstrates a systemic flaw with how we handle forensic evidence. But this should not conceal the overwhelming evidence of abuse. Dorothy Wing's plea agreement, in which she received 15 years in return for her testimony, was similarly divisive. Some considered it as a necessary concession to achieve Randy's conviction, while others saw it as disrespectful to Evangelina's memory. One protester claimed during a neighborhood gathering that 15 years is insufficient punishment for a mother who saw her children be tortured. The case sparked debates about justice, responsibility, and the shortcomings that enabled the abuse to go unchecked. On the other side, several legal experts contended that Dorothy's punishment was justified given her pressured and controlled situation. One criminal psychologist observed that victims of manipulation often feel helpless to act. Dorothy's participation in this tragedy illustrates both her personal shortcoming and the system's inability to act. This case sparked ethical debates concerning plea bargaining in situations of child abuse. Is it worthwhile to reduce a sentence if it helps bring a criminal to justice, or does it diminish the gravity of the crimes committed? The absence of a clear explanation only fueled the displeasure over the case's conclusion. Evangelina's brothers, ages 2 and 5 at the time of her death, were taken into protective custody after being removed from their mother's care. The physical scars from their maltreatment started to heal, but the mental traumas remained deep. The lads later moved to California. According to reports, they had considerable treatment to help them cope with their tragedy. A child psychologist who dealt with the boys praised their resilience. They've been through unspeakable anguish, but they've shown great strength. They're gradually understanding what it means to feel protected and cherished. While their lives have improved, the shadow of their past persists. Advocates have used their narrative to advocate for improved support systems for child abuse survivors, highlighting the value of long-term care and stability. The case of Evangelina Wing exposed apparent institutional flaws that led to her death. One of the most significant concerns was Randy Roden's lack of control in the past. Despite his history of domestic violence and probation breaches, he was able to move into Dorothy's house without raising any concerns. Child Protective Services had no previous interaction with the family, exposing the youngsters to unregulated abuse. This was a failure at every level, said one child welfare advocate. From probation officials to neighbors to the court system, there were several chances to intercede, but none were taken. The case also highlighted the need for tougher background checks and more comprehensive training for individuals who deal with vulnerable families. Activists advocated for improvements to guarantee that no kid falls between the gaps again. Evangelina's life was brutally cut short, but her narrative has made a lasting impression on those who heard it. She was a small girl who enjoyed laughing, playing with her brothers, and finding pleasure in the simplest of things. Her death is a depressing reminder of how easily innocence can be lost when society turns a blind eye. Evangelina's tale is one we should never forget. Her suffering should serve as a wake-up call for all of us to stay watchful, speak out, and defend those who cannot protect themselves. How many more youngsters must suffer? Every kid needs a secure and loving environment. Yet for far too many, their homes, which are supposed to protect them, become the source of terrible misery. The statistics surrounding child abuse are both startling and frightening. Let's take a deeper look at the numbers that show the full scale of the situation. In 2022, approximately 558,000 children in the United States were confirmed victims of abuse and neglect. That's approximately 8 out of every 1,000 youngsters. The most prevalent kind of abuse is neglect. It impacts a staggering 74.3% of victims. Physical and sexual abuse follow, but neglect typically prepares the way for more serious, long-term injury. These figures are more than simply statistics. They represent actual children. Each instance has a narrative of trauma that may have been avoided. The deaths caused by child maltreatment are the most terrible realities. In 2021, an estimated 1,820 children perished as a result of abuse and neglect. That is 5 children every day. Each was a life full of possibilities, hopes dashed because no one intervened in time. Detecting child abuse at an early stage is one of the most difficult obstacles in dealing with it. In 2022, there were over 4.3 million referrals to Child Protective Services, affecting 7.5 million children. 3 million youngsters got investigations or alternate replies. Despite these efforts, numerous incidents remain undiscovered, trapping vulnerable youngsters in perilous situations. The wounds of abuse do not vanish after the abuse has ended. For many survivors, the impacts last a lifetime. According to studies, children who have experienced abuse or neglect are 9 times more likely to engage in criminal action later in life. Approximately 80% of 21-year-olds who were mistreated as children suffer from at least one psychiatric condition. Consider this. 8 out of 10 young individuals carry the unseen burden of their trauma into adulthood. These statistics depict a bleak image, but they are more than simply data. They are a call to action. The issue is, what can we do to modify the outcomes? Together, we can transform these tragic statistics into tales of hope, rehabilitation, and prevention. Every number we've provided reflects a child's life that required someone to notice, care about, and act. Let us remember those who were failed by the system, and let their experiences inspire us to never let it happen again. And thus we come to the end of this unsettling narrative, one filled with lost innocence, unspeakable brutality, and lingering concerns about justice. The terrible story of Evangelina Wing challenges us to face the worst parts of human nature while also focusing on the structural flaws that enabled this to occur. Justice was delivered in court, but given the lenient punishments and the permanent wounds inflicted on Evangelina's surviving brothers, can any penalty possibly compare to the atrocities faced by these children? How can we, as a society, guarantee that no kid falls between the gaps again? What might neighbors or community members have done differently to help avoid this tragedy? Do you believe systemic improvements, such as tougher background checks or improved child welfare processes, would make a difference? How can we, as people, be watchful for indicators of child abuse and respond when necessary? We would love to hear your ideas and comments. In these critical discussions, your opinion is vital. While you're here, be sure to check out our other videos, like and subscribe to help support our channel, and join us in bringing light on tales that should never be forgotten. A 5-year-old child full of life and potential was sold for $2,500 to a guy with a troubled background. Her aspirations of being a princess evaporated in an instant. This is not a tale for the faint of heart, but it ought to be shared. Camari Holland was only 5 years old, a youngster with hopes and innocence that should have been safeguarded by those who were meant to love her the most. Instead, her mother gave her over to a guy whose life had been marked by violence and cruelty. In exchange, she was removed from the planet permanently. What happened to Camari is more than a tragedy. It is a betrayal at its most basic. It's about a mother who failed her kid in the worst manner conceivable. It's the tale of a guy with a criminal record who should never have had contact with children, but did because a system failed to see the warning signals until it was too late. I honestly hope I didn't have to bring this up again. As we travel through this heartbreaking case, we'll see it from several perspectives: the bereaved fathers, the detectives who put together the facts, and the unsettling reality of Camari's existence before it was cut short. Every narrative has common feelings that we can all relate to, such as dread for our children, bewilderment that someone close to us could betray us, and sadness when the innocent are taken away too soon. While this case is upsetting, it is critical that we confront it, because only by identifying these tragedies can we begin to protect those who are unable to defend themselves. Camari's tale is one that cannot be overlooked. Welcome to Unseen True Crime Stories HQ. I want to thank you, my viewers, and particularly my subscribers, for your continued support as we work to improve and bring you new and untold real crime tales every day. Please remember to subscribe to this channel. Let's get started. Camari Holland was a tiny girl with a hopeful heart, sparkling eyes, and a grin that could brighten any room. She was 5 years old, and the world was her playground. She wasn't yet overwhelmed by life's harsh facts. In her imagination, she was a princess, just like the ones in the novels she adored. A princess with a destiny she would never witness. Camari lives with her father, Corey Holland, in Phoenix City, Alabama. Corey was a loving father who would do everything for his children. He was the sort of parent who was always present, getting up early, preparing breakfast, assisting with schoolwork, and ensuring Camari felt protected and loved. Corey had an unbreakable link with his daughter, one full of care and protection. Regardless all the obstacles life threw at Camari, he remained the constant in her life. Corey tried his best to be a good dad. It was not flawless, but it was adequate for Camari. It was more than sufficient. She enjoyed spending time with her father, who made her feel special every day. Their bond was strong, founded on trust, love, and an underlying guarantee of protection. But then came the weekend, when Camari would go to her mother's place. She was thrilled. She couldn't wait. For a small girl, a visit to Mom's home was exciting, particularly since it represented a respite from the daily routine. Corey was reluctant, as he often does, but when he saw how pleased Camari was, he gave in. He was certain that her mother, Christy, would look after her. At least that was his hope. Corey had no idea that this would be the final time he saw his little child alive. The relationship between Camari's parents, Corey and Christy, was complex. It lacked the love and harmony that you'd expect for their children. It was a relationship fraught with stress and strain, the result of too many misunderstandings, broken promises, and unhealed scars. Corey adored Camari, but he was also very concerned about Christy. Christy had her own challenges, which no kid should ever have to see. Her struggles with drug misuse were well documented, and they hampered her capacity to care for her children. Christy was not always there when it counted the most. Her struggle to remain sober resulted in choices that Corey did not comprehend. Regardless of how much she cared for her children, it was evident that her addiction had taken priority. There were times when Corey tried to speak to Christy about Camari's well-being and future plans, but it seemed like Christy wasn't listening. Her drug issues harmed not just her relationship with Corey, but also her ability to be the mother Camari deserved. Corey was always concerned. He understood Camari's need for a steady setting, something Christy could not always supply. Despite this, Corey let Camari leave with Christy that weekend. He noticed how excited Camari was at the prospect of spending time with her mother, and he hoped and prayed that things would be different this time. What was supposed to be a weekend visit turned into a nightmare that no parent should ever experience. However, at the moment, all Corey could think about was his daughter's delight, not the tragic events that would occur only hours later. It was December 12th, 2021, a Sunday, and the day should have been like any other. However, for Corey, it was not just another weekend. It was the day he had to make a choice he'd live to regret. Camry's mother, Christy, arrived at his home to collect their daughter for the weekend. Despite the custody agreement that Corey had battled so hard for, Christy retained visiting rights. It was always a tricky balance, and Corey knew Camry's enthusiasm was difficult to ignore. When his kid spotted her mother standing at the door, she virtually leaped up and down with excitement. She rushed up to Christy, putting her arms around her with the same naive joy Corey had seen 100 times before. As Corey watched them, he felt a weight on his chest and a familiar sorrow in his heart. A part of him wanted to say no, to keep Camry near and protected. However, his love for her and desire to see her happy pushed him in the other way. Camry was overjoyed at the prospect of spending time with her mother, and who was he to prevent it? So he let her leave with one last kiss and wave. Camry was gone, eager to visit her mother. Corey waited at the door, watching them go away, dread seeping back in like a dark shadow. Christy's house in Columbus, Georgia, wasn't big. It was a little apartment in a peaceful area, but it lacked the stability Camry required. When you entered within the mess, there was always a sensation of confusion, as if something was missing or that things were never completely in order. It seemed as if Christy was attempting to keep everything together, but the strands kept falling through her fingers. On December 13th, 2021, Christy Sipple awakened to an empty home. She looked at the clock, 6 a.m. Her first thought was of Camry, her young child, who should have been there, securely tucked into bed. However, when she entered the living room, she saw something was wrong. The entrance of the home was wide open, and Camry had left. Panic set in. Christy hurried around the home, looking for any sign of her daughter. Nothing. There was no indication of struggle, no trace of Camry's whereabouts. Only an unpleasant sensation that something was very wrong. Christy called 911 right away, her voice quivering as she reported Camry missing. "My daughter is gone," she said. "I woke up and she was just gone." The dispatcher on the other line attempted to calm her down by asking for facts like where she had last seen Camry and what time she had gone to bed. Christy relayed the narrative as best she could, her words hurried, frenzied, and riddled with uncertainty. She wasn't sure what had occurred. Camry was present when she fell asleep. How could she suddenly vanish? However, as the cops arrived, the situation grew more difficult. The Columbus Police Department responded quickly, but something didn't seem right. Officers searched the neighborhood around Christy's house, but there were no quick leads, no evidence of a break-in, and nothing indicating an abduction. The issue gradually escalated from a missing youngster to something more concerning. Phoenix City officials were summoned to help, and a task force was quickly constituted to conduct an investigation. The investigation went rapidly, with Columbus police and Phoenix City officials working together to track every lead. Phone records, security video, and interviews with neighbors started to reveal a different story. Christy's story that the door had been left open and that Camry had fled throughout the night did not stand up. However, the breakthrough occurred when detectives linked Christy to a guy called Jeremy Williams. He was a familiar name to them. Williams lived in Alaska in 2005, and his background was chilling. He was accused of killing his own daughter, but there was never enough evidence to bring charges. And it did not end there. In 2009, while residing in Phoenix, he was accused of molesting a 3-year-old kid, but the case was dismissed owing to a lack of evidence. Williams had a habit, a terrible past that kept returning to torment him. As the pieces started to fall into place, Christy's tale got more difficult to believe. Investigators discovered security video from adjacent cameras that showed Christy and Jeremy together on the night Camry disappeared. It wasn't simply a casual acquaintance. There was a deeper connection than Christy had first led them to think. This wasn't the first time her judgment was called into question. Then came the most unsettling aspect of all, Camry's toys. The day following her daughter's death, Christy was observed collecting Camry's belongings, including her treasured toys, and giving them to a local charity. It was a strange move. Parents who have just lost a child are unlikely to hurry to give up their kids' items, particularly while their loss is so new. This move alone sparked suspicions, throwing an even worse light on Christie's participation. Christie's criminal history simply contributed to the mounting evidence. She has a history of legal problems. In 2018, she was charged with child negligence after her infant tested positive for methamphetamine. And the allegations did not end there. According to reports, Christie has a history of neglecting to appear in court in child endangerment matters. It was apparent that Christie had not been the mother Kamari deserved. The more the police discovered, the clearer it appeared that Christie was more than simply an unlucky mother stuck in a horrible scenario. She was a lady who had a history of making bad, often deadly, judgments. And now it seems that those judgments had resulted in the ultimate betrayal, the killing of her own daughter. The uncertainties that had swirled around her in the beginning were being replaced by a more horrific truth. Christie had given her daughter over to a guy with a history of violence and abuse, and Kamari was now gone for good. As the inquiry progressed, investigators realized that Jeremy and Christie had a deeper relationship than they had previously imagined. They weren't just acquaintances, they were close. Jeremy was someone Christie trusted and had accepted into her life. And when the police dug more, they found he may be involved in more than simply Kamari's abduction. Could he have planned this all along, using Christie to get access to Kamari? The truth remained just out of grasp, but the pieces were coming into place, each more terrifying than the previous. Then, on December 14th, 2021, only one day after Kamari's abduction, the police got a call no parent should ever receive. They discovered Kamari's corpse. The home where they discovered her was a shell of neglect, chilly and abandoned, a place that seemed forgotten, as if the world had turned its back on it long ago. It stood on the outskirts, separated from the rest of the community, much like the tragedies that had occurred behind its walls. No one had lived there in a long time, but on that night, it became the ultimate resting place for a 5-year-old child. Kamari's corpse was found in the basement, and the sight was both awful and devastating. She had been violently strangled with a rope, and the frigid air in the home offered little consolation to her small, dead figure. But it wasn't simply how she was slain. It was the cruelty she had suffered before to her death. This was a youngster who had lost everything, including her future, innocence, and, most cruelly, her safety. Corey, Kamari's father, was devastated by the news. To learn that his little child, the daughter he had worked so hard to protect, had been snatched in such a terrible, senseless manner. He could not believe it. The anguish was so intense and visceral. It seemed like his heart had been torn out. He trusted Christie. He had believed Kamari would be secure. And now she was gone. The sadness, remorse, and disbelief had overtaken him. The community, too, was shocked. Columbus and Phoenix City had been shook to the core. They'd seen Kamari grow up, running around the streets with the same wide-eyed excitement that all children have. They now had to accept the truth that a kid they knew was no longer alive, a girl whose life had been taken by those who were entrusted to protect her. The finding of Kamari's corpse was a turning point in the inquiry. It was no longer about locating a lost kid. It was about obtaining justice for a little girl who had been let down by those who should have loved her most. The case was no longer simply another heartbreaking loss. It was a plea for responsibility so that the truth might be revealed, no matter how dark it was. Jeremy Williams had been on the run for a few days, but the police quickly closed in. On December 15th, 2021, little than 48 hours after Kamari's death was discovered, Jeremy was traced down to the Bamboo Motel in Phoenix City, Alabama, a rundown establishment that you wouldn't want to stay in unless you had no other options. Jeremy had checked in only hours earlier, and when police came, they discovered him there, hidden in plain sight. The capture seemed nearly anticlimactic. There was no dramatic pursuit or frenzied escape, just the cold fact that the police knew precisely where he was, and it was only a matter of time until they apprehended him. When the cops entered his room, Jeremy did not attempt to flee. Instead, he seemed resigned, as if he knew the inevitable had arrived. They hauled him into custody, and the tension in the air increased. The questions came swiftly, and Jeremy's replies were slow and careful, as if he was attempting to hide something. However, investigators were not misled. They could see the flaws in his tale as the falsehoods began to unravel. His thoughts had already started to betray him. The questioning began with the basics. Where was he the night Kamari went missing? What was his role? Jeremy seemed calm at first, but the veneer quickly crumbled. The guy who had been carrying the weight of his own criminal history gradually began to share more than he had planned. Jeremy revealed his participation in Kamari's killing. However, he spoke in an uncomfortable, almost nonchalant tone. He spoke about his acts as if they were an afterthought, like they were simply another horrible thing he'd done in a long succession of bad judgments. What surprised detectives was not simply his admission, but the disturbing specificity of his confession. He felt no guilt, just a weird, icy indifference. Jeremy talked about Kamari as if she were simply another victim in his cycle of violence, no different from the others he had injured over the years. His history of sexual assault was more than just a rumor. It was a well-documented path of agony that spanned years, resulting in far too many victims and ruined lives. As the interview progressed, the cops pressed harder. They wanted to know not just about Kamari, but about everything Jeremy had done. His participation in other cases, which had been dismissed but continued to plague him, were now being reopened. Jeremy's arrest had refocused the spotlight on him, and detectives were starting to put together the whole picture of his depravity. They knew he was involved in multiple previous crimes, including unresolved murders and abuse cases dating back over a decade. What's the unsettling thing? Each time, Jeremy had slid through the gaps with just enough doubt and deception to walk free. But everything was changing. With the confession out in the open, the police were eager to investigate further to connect the dots between his history and the atrocities he had committed. His days of hiding were done. As the inquiry progressed, officials discovered more than simply Jeremy Williams' terrible participation in Kamari's murder. They quickly identified Christy Sippel's deeper participation in the crime, including her complicity in the human trafficking of her own daughter. She had not only permitted Kamari to accompany Jeremy, she had deliberately sold her daughter for money, making a choice that would cost Kamari her life. The revelation struck the neighborhood like a freight train. Christy, the mother everyone assumed was a victim, was proven to be an active participant in her daughter's misery. It wasn't simply carelessness or bad judgment. Christy had willingly given her kid over to a guy with a criminal record, a man who would do awful things to Kamari. And for what? Kamari lost everything in a rapid money deal. The shock was profound. Nobody could believe that a mother, who was supposed to defend her kid at all costs, could betray her like way. Christy's behavior were terrible. People couldn't comprehend how a mother could accept, much alone actively facilitate, such a heinous conduct. It damaged the community's feeling of safety and confidence in those they believed they knew. Corey was devastated by the discovery. For months, he thought that Christy's inability to care for Kamari was due to her addictions or circumstances. But realizing that Christy was implicated in Kamari's killing, the woman who had once sworn to love and protect her, was a crushing blow for Corey. The father who had spent his whole life trying to safeguard his daughter now confronted the awful realization that the same lady he had previously trusted with his kid had played a direct part in her death. He was outraged, but anguish engulfed him. How could he ever forgive Christy for what she had done to Kamari? Could he ever imagine the death of a daughter at the hands of her mother? But when the matter progressed to court, the legal ramifications began to emerge. Jeremy Williams' trial started with an unusual plea. He did not dispute his crimes, but rather pled not guilty due to mental illness or defect. The public's response was quick and harsh. They wanted him to suffer the full consequences of his misdeeds. The thought that he might avoid culpability for his actions because of his mental condition sparked outrage. His appeal failed to alter popular opinion. People who had been following this story from the beginning wanted justice, and they were not going to let a legal loophole enable this guy to escape his punishment. Jeremy Williams was accused with a number of severe felonies, including first-degree capital murder, people trafficking, and corpse abuse. On April 24th, 2024, Jeremy Williams was sentenced to 4 death sentences for the murder and torture of Kamari Holland. He will most certainly spend years on death row before being executed, given the procedure takes time in the United States. In more recent news, Williams was said to be appealing his sentence in December 2024, with the state funding his defense counsel. Christie's court case took an unexpected turn. In a surprising move, she pled guilty to human trafficking. She did not defend the allegations, and the entire scope of her involvement in the crime was exposed for everyone to see. She faced significant accusations, but the worst part was the possibility of receiving a low sentence. As the allegations were read, several individuals in the courtroom were stunned. How could a woman who sold her own kid, allowing for horrendous torture and death, be sentenced to just 20 years in prison? It seemed like a smack in the face for Kamari's memory and for Corey, who had worked so hard to keep his daughter safe. The public's wrath was great. Many individuals believed Christie deserved far more than just 20 years. How could society allow someone who had committed such a horrific act to get such a light sentence? People were outraged not just at Christie, but also at the legal system, which seemed to fail Kamari at every point. It was a smack in the face for everyone who knew Kamari and felt she deserved a shot in life. Corey Holland's pain was beyond anything anybody could completely comprehend until they had experienced it. It was a silent type of anguish, the kind that grips your chest and refuses to let go. The loss of Kamari was like a void that could never be filled, and every day, Corey felt the weight of his choice to let her go to Christie that weekend. He had always been a devoted father to Kamari, doing all he could to provide for her and make her feel secure. Despite his best attempts, he couldn't stop himself from wondering, what if I had kept her with me that weekend? What if I hadn't let her leave? It wasn't only his daughter's death that hurt. It was the weight of knowing he had let her down when she needed him the most. That voice would not cease. That guilt would always remain, no matter how hard he tried to go on. As the trial faded and the legal processes concluded, moral problems remained. How could a mother betray her child? How could Christie Sipple, who should have been Kamari's guardian, allow such atrocities to happen? The mere concept seemed difficult to comprehend. A part of us want to think that people are born good, that everyone, deep down, has the ability for love and kindness. Christie's actions, however, did more than shock the community. They called into question that notion. Could we ever know why she did what she did? Or was she just wicked, unable to recognize the harm she was doing? As the narrative of Kamari's life concludes in tragedy, we are left with the terrible question: how can we prevent this from occurring again? How can we safeguard the most vulnerable children among us from those who would exploit, damage, or, in the most horrific scenario, sell them for a price? The solution is not simple, but it begins with raising awareness, ensuring that these crimes do not slide through the gaps of the system, and demanding better for our children. Kamari's life was full with possibilities, love, and pleasure. She was a princess in the making, full of hope and aspirations. Those who were supposed to safeguard her took her life and broke her innocence. And when we reflect on her tale, we recall the youngster who had so much to offer a little girl who never got the opportunity to see her goals realized. We remember Kamari Holland not as a victim, but as a light that will always shine in the hearts of all who loved her. In 2021 alone, Georgia received 106,948 allegations of child abuse and neglect. Over 9,800 instances were verified, while an additional 38,800 children received alternate answers, such as family support programs. What's even more distressing is that 64% of these incidents were caused by neglect, implying that parents or guardians were not only failing to safeguard their children, but also leaving them unprotected with no one to intervene. This is not simply a state matter. It is a communal issue. Let's concentrate on Columbus, Georgia, the city at the heart of Kamari's narrative. Muskogee County, which includes Columbus, had 1,870 allegations of child abuse in only 1 year, impacting over 1,600 children. The incidence of maltreatment here is greater than the state norm, at 30.9 per 10,000 children. That means more children are harmed, and more families are ripped apart. During that period, 184 children were taken from their families, many of whom were neglected or faced the perils of drug misuse. But this is about more than numbers. It is about the children, the genuine faces and futures behind the statistics. The reality is, things can be improved. There are methods to prevent catastrophes like this from occurring. Education and resources are crucial. Giving parents the skills they need to raise healthy, happy children is vital. We can avoid situations like these from worsening by providing mental health care, drug addiction treatment, and parenting assistance to needy families. But it does not end there. It is also about improving the system so that Child Protective Services can react more quickly, efficiently, and with greater resources. It is about ensuring that every kid is safeguarded, not only those who are presently in danger, but also those who may be at risk. We cannot afford to be inactive any longer. We remember Kamari Holland not just as a victim, but also as a representation of all the children we must safeguard. Her hopes, innocence, and potential had all been robbed from her. However, her tale is about more than simply grief. It is also about what we can do to ensure that future children do not suffer the same fate. Kamari was a small girl who wanted to be a princess. And although her life was brutally cut short, we owe it to her and other children like her to make their futures better. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know your opinions in the comments area.